At 6:23 a.m., border surveillance registered an entry at the Northern Passage International Crossing. The individual was Elena Navarro, leader of the Democratic Coalition Party, who had been in exile for 17 months following disputed national elections. At 6:31 a.m., the Federal Border Authority notified the Executive's office, the legislature, and the Superior Tribunal. At 6:47 a.m., the Executive held an emergency press conference about ongoing tensions with the Western Republic. Quote, "If their leadership continues threatening our sovereignty, we will consider all options, including targeted removal of regime figures who pose existential threats to our national security." The statement did not mention Navarro's return, but the timing created immediate crisis. Navarro claims she won the presidential election and that the current executive holds office through fraudulent vote counting. And the executive had just made an internationally inflammatory statement that could trigger diplomatic or military escalation. Subscribe to this channel immediately, because what you are witnessing is not a single crisis. This is two constitutional crises occurring simultaneously and interacting in ways that amplify both. This is an opposition leader returning to claim electoral legitimacy, while the executive makes statements that could commit the nation to military action. This is the legislature having to decide whether to address domestic authority disputes or international escalation first. And this is allied governments watching to determine whether they recognize an executive whose legitimacy is actively being challenged, or an opposition leader whose electoral claims were never independently verified. Turn on notifications, because the next 48 hours will determine whether the constitutional system can handle simultaneous internal and external authority disputes, whether the executive's international statements carry weight when domestic legitimacy is contested, and whether the nation can project coherent foreign policy while its leadership structure is in dispute. Here is what led to this moment. 17 months ago, national elections were held. Official results showed the incumbent executive winning with 52.3%. Elena Navarro claimed the results were fraudulent and that exit polling showed her winning with 58%. International observers issued divided reports. The Superior Tribunal ruled that while irregularities occurred, there was insufficient evidence to overturn certified results. The executive was sworn in. Navarro organized mass protests. After 3 months, the executive issued an arrest warrant for inciting civil disorder. Navarro fled to exile in the alliance states. For 17 months, she has operated a government in exile. The current executive has governed with contested legitimacy, recognized by some nations and rejected by others. But here is where it shifted. 48 hours ago, tensions with the Western Republic escalated. The Republic had been conducting naval exercises near our maritime boundaries for 6 weeks. Yesterday morning, a Republic patrol vessel allegedly crossed into our territorial waters. The executive claimed incursion. The Republic denied it. At 4:17 p.m. yesterday, the executive addressed the National Security Council, stating the Republic was testing our resolve and that clear deterrent messaging was necessary. The executive's advisors drafted diplomatic language, but the executive reportedly stated diplomatic language was insufficient and that personal consequences were needed. At 11:34 p.m. last night, intelligence reported Navarro had left the alliance states and was traveling toward our border. Border authorities were instructed to detain her upon entry. At 2:47 a.m., Navarro posted she was returning to claim her rightful position. At 4:12 a.m., crowds began gathering at the Northern Passage. By 6 a.m., thousands of supporters were present. At 6:23 a.m., Navarro crossed. Border authorities did not attempt detention, stating that executing the arrest warrant against an individual surrounded by thousands would trigger violent confrontation. Now, watch what happens next. At 6:31 a.m., all relevant institutions were notified. At 6:39 a.m., the legislature called for restraint and constitutional dialogue. At 6:42 a.m., the executive's office received briefing on Navarro's crossing. Advisors recommended immediate action. But at 6:47 a.m., the executive addressed the Western Republic situation instead. Quote, "The Western Republic's leadership has demonstrated contempt for our sovereignty. We will defend our nation. If their leadership continues this path, We will consider all options, including targeted removal of regime figures who pose existential threats. The phrase targeted removal of regime figures suggests potential assassination or forced removal. The statement was broadcast live and became global news within minutes. At 7:04 a.m., the Western Republic demanded immediate retraction and apology, stating it was consulting allies on sanctions and defensive military posture adjustments. At 7:18 a.m., 3 allied governments expressed concern at 7:23 a.m. Navarro held a roadside press conference, quote, "The person who just made that reckless statement does not speak for our nation because that person does not legitimately hold executive authority. I am the elected leader. I will not permit an illegitimate executive to drag us into international crisis. Drop a comment right now. Tell me who has the authority to make foreign policy statements binding on the nation. The executive who holds office under disputed election results, or the opposition leader who claims electoral victory, but whose claims were rejected by the courts." I am reading every response because this is the question allied governments, the Western Republic, and our own military and diplomatic corps are asking at this moment. At 7:41 a.m., the legislature held an emergency session. 2 resolutions were introduced, one calling for executive retraction of the Western Republic statement, another calling for constitutional dialogue between the executive and Navarro. The legislature debated which was more urgent. At 8:17 a.m., they voted 34-31 to address both simultaneously through a combined resolution stating the executive should retract the statement and engage in mediated talks with Navarro at 8:29 a.m. The executive rejected the resolution, stating foreign policy is exclusively an executive function under Article 5 and that the legislature has no authority to direct executive diplomatic communications. The statement also said Navarro is a fugitive, and the executive will not engage in dialogue with individuals evading prosecution. At 8:47 a.m., Navarro arrived in the capital surrounded by over 50,000 people. The Federal Security Service did not attempt arrest. At 9:03 a.m., Navarro addressed the crowd, calling on institutions to recognize the will of the people and transfer authority peacefully. At 9:17 a.m., the Federal Security Service Director issued an internal directive telling personnel to maintain professional neutrality and avoid taking sides. That directive essentially told security personnel not to arrest Navarro, but also not to recognize her authority. At 9:34 a.m., the Joint Military Command held an emergency meeting discussing whether the executive statement about the Western Republic constituted lawful foreign policy, or whether a contested executive could commit the nation to potential military action. The command issued no public statement at 9:52 a.m. The Western Republic's ambassador requested emergency meeting with our foreign minister. At 10:14 a.m., the ambassador delivered a formal note requesting clarification on whether the executive statement represented official policy. The minister stated executive statements are official unless retracted. The ambassador asked whether the executive possessed legitimate authority to make such statements given the domestic situation. The minister reportedly had no response. There is a detail most people missed. The Constitution's Article 5 grants the executive authority over foreign policy and diplomatic relations. Article 3 grants the legislature authority to declare war and approve international treaties. But there is no article addressing what happens when the executive's domestic legitimacy is disputed while simultaneously engaging in foreign policy that could lead to conflict. If Navarro's electoral claims are correct, then the current executive lacks authority to make binding international commitments. But if the current executive's position is constitutionally valid, despite the disputed election, then Navarro's statements carry no weight. The constitutional system has no mechanism for resolving this when both claims are asserted simultaneously. At 10:47 a.m., allied governments began issuing recognition statements. 2 allies recognized the current executive as legitimate. One called for international mediation. One stated it will not recognize any commitments until the legitimacy dispute is resolved. At 11:23 a.m., the Western Republic recalled its ambassador and suspended diplomatic relations until the executive retracts the statement. At 11:34 a.m., the Republic announced increased naval presence as a defensive measure. This is the moment it stopped being a domestic political dispute and became an international authority crisis. At 11:47 a.m., the defense minister was asked whether military forces would respond if the Western Republic's naval presence led to incidents. The command requested clarification on whether the legitimacy dispute affected chain of command at 12:04 p.m. The minister stated the executive is the constitutional commander and chain of command is clear at 12:11 p.m. 3 senior military legal advisors resigned, stating following orders from a contested executive creates unacceptable constitutional risk. At 12:34 p.m., Navarro announced formation of a transition authority and called on institutions to begin orderly transfer of power, stating the executive's inflammatory statements demonstrate unfitness for office. At 12:47 p.m. The executive stated Navarro's transition authority has no legal standing and that any officials cooperating with her will be prosecuted for sedition. At 1:14 p.m., the Superior Tribunal issued a rare statement. The tribunal's earlier election ruling stands. However, the tribunal calls on all parties to engage in dialogue to restore public confidence. The tribunal cannot resolve political disputes through judicial decree. The statement was carefully neutral but did not reaffirm the executive's full legitimacy or dismiss Navarro's claims entirely. Here are the indicators we are watching. Does the executive retract the Western Republic statement or double down? Does Navarro attempt to occupy government facilities? Do any institutions recognize Navarro's transition authority? Does the legislature take stronger action? Do allied governments shift recognition positions? Does the Western Republic take military action? Do military commanders refuse orders citing legitimacy dispute? Here are the 3 scenarios. Scenario 1. Constitutional dialogue occurs, facing international isolation and domestic division. Both parties agree to mediated talks. Some form of power-sharing, new elections, or verification process is established. Both crises de-escalate. This is the constitutional resolution scenario. Scenario 2, parallel governance emerges. Navarro establishes a transition authority that some institutions recognize. The executive maintains control of security forces and key allied recognition. The nation operates with divided authority. Foreign policy becomes incoherent. The Western Republic exploits the division. This is the fragmentation scenario. Scenario 3, the executive consolidates through international crisis. The executive uses Western Republic tensions to rally support. Arguing national unity is required during external threats. Navarro's return is framed as destabilizing. Security forces arrest Navarro. International criticism increases, but the executive maintains control. This is the authoritarian consolidation scenario. The federal constitution has governed this nation for 139 years. Electoral disputes have occurred 7 times. In every previous case, either courts resolved the dispute and the losing party accepted the ruling, or political negotiations led to compromise. This is the first time an opposition leader has returned from exile after courts rejected electoral challenges, while simultaneously the executive has made inflammatory foreign policy statements triggering international crisis. What I know for certain right now, at 6:23 a.m., Navarro entered the country. At 6:47 a.m., the executive made a statement about targeted removal of Western Republic regime figures. At 8:17 a.m., the legislature called for retraction and dialogue. At 8:29 a.m., the executive rejected both. At 11:23 a.m., the Western Republic recalled its ambassador. At 12:11 p.m., military legal advisors resigned, citing constitutional uncertainty. At 12:34 p.m., Navarro announced a transition authority. The executive claims constitutional continuity. Navarro claims electoral legitimacy. The military is uncertain about chain of command. Allied governments are divided. The Western Republic is increasing military posture, and the Constitution provides no mechanism for determining authority when both domestic electoral disputes and international crises occur simultaneously. The question is whether constitutional systems can maintain coherent governance when internal legitimacy and external policy crises reinforce each other. At 1:47 p.m., the Federal Constitutional Archive recorded the following entry: Opposition leader, border entry confirmed, executive foreign policy statement issued, legislative mediation rejected, institutional recognition divided, international diplomatic status uncertain, constitutional authority disputed under dual crisis conditions, and whether the next entry records resolution through dialogue, fragmentation into parallel governance, or consolidation through crisis will determine whether constitutional order remains intact or whether the collision of internal and external authority disputes has revealed gaps that cannot be resolved through existing mechanisms.